I was about 16, I think, 15, 16, and a friend at school had started, I think, a podcast. And I was quite jealous of that kind of creative outlet. And so I think very transparently, like the week later, I started my own competing podcast. And that kind of grew from something that was very amorphous. And I had this idea that I was going to like cover lots of different stuff, like cover the arts, this fucking London 16-year-old with this idea that he's going to completely revolutionize arts coverage. And I just very quickly realized that I didn't really have an interest in most of it, but that I really took to writing about film, and like I liked it, even though I wasn't very good at it at the point. So I, over the course of about 6 months, went from having this slightly weird, badly put together podcast called Ultra Culture to making that into a movie blog, which fortunately was at the point where movie blogs were kind of a fairly new hot thing in the States and hadn't massively made much of a dent here in terms of the like film critical language. And so I think I was just kind of well placed for that to become a thing. It was definitely wildly different than it is now. I mean, this was only 2008, which is not even 10 years ago. But I remember at that time, there were almost no or possibly none online specific kind of PR outlets for film. So when I first started, I think I started by literally like writing physical letters and sending them through the post to different film companies. And, I only loosely had a sense of what a distributor even was. Like I really didn't understand that world. And I remember just like one by one over the course of about a year, I finally managed to build up some kind of connection to each distributor. And it started, and like I really massively appreciate and respect the kind of small distributors that at the beginning like gave me a chance and like let me come along to their screenings when I was like this 16-year-old with a blog that no one read. And I think part of it was like the novelty at the time, because they didn't get any requests really from like people outside of that circuit, or at least that's what they said to me. So like, I think they were just intrigued by it. And I would go to screenings and be the youngest by a factor of like 15 years. And the only one that I knew about who seemed to be writing for online, which changed so rapidly in like the next 3 or 4 years to the point where almost every contact I had was suddenly with an online only PR agency. And every time I went to screenings, I was just surrounded by other people more or less my age. And like I think I was just very lucky to kind of get in at the ground floor with that shift in the UK. Because even in the US, I think I would have been late. Well, now, because I work as a filmmaker as well, that's sort of more of my income than the film criticism. And when I started, I was lucky that I was a kid. I was like still living at home, so I didn't really have a need to make a massive amount off it for the first 2-3 years, which is really, I think, the only reason I was able to become established at all, because I think that must be incredibly difficult if you have like financial obligations and you're trying to crack into that world. But yeah, in between, there was probably like a 1 year, 2 year period where all I did was film criticism, and could scrape by. I lived in a little flat and could make the rent just about each month. So it's possible, but yeah, I don't know where I would be now if I didn't have another source of income. It is a great riposte to any kind of like some of those really cliched attacks on critics of like, oh, if you knew how hard it was to make a film. And I can obviously say like, oh, I have, and it's not that hard. Or, all that kind of stuff that seeks to separate those two things that I find kind of ridiculous. I think someone referred to me as like a failed blogger turned filmmaker, which I quite liked as like a reversal of that cliche. But yeah, personally, I don't see the two as different really. Like my starting point with almost anything I do is like, I think about the idea for a while and slowly I get a sense of what medium that would work in. So I've had films I've made where originally I imagined it as like a long form article I might write, or a blog post even, and then maybe it's just ballooned into something different, or I've wanted there to be a visual element. Likewise, I've had film ideas that over time I've realized don't really make sense for film and I want to just write. And my work as a filmmaker is often to do with film itself. So obviously I'm kind of walking that line more obviously than most people. But I really, I'm really of the opinion that like any film criticism is art and any film is kind of film criticism. Because I don't think there are many or any filmmakers working who aren't exposed constantly to other films and other people's ideas and allow that to influence their work, or for their work to inadvertently or intentionally be a response to other people's work. I think, I really don't see the lines between any of these things. I really don't. I think, like, sure, if there's like a film journalist writing that actors have it really easy and they show up for half an hour each day on set and then they go home or whatever. If they're like actually writing factually incorrect stuff, I don't know, maybe they should go and hang out on a set for a day and have a better understanding. But the vast majority of times that I hear that sentiment expressed, that like, oh, critics need to know how hard it is, or critics need to know the practical reality of working on a film, it's usually because a critic has like had the temerity to criticize something. And so what it actually seems to be saying is you should go and witness or experience how hard it is to make a film so that you then self-regulate your critical faculties, which to me seems like a terrible piece of advice for a film critic, that you should be more biased. You should be like more exposed to something that would limit your ability to be honest. And sure, like, I don't think critics or anyone should go around like hurling personal insults or being unnecessarily cruel or dismissive or whatever about anyone's line of work. But I think there is a perfect validity in being honest about a film's failings, and however hard that film was to make, I really think has no bearing on that. So yeah, I've seen enough critics get a taste of filmmaking and suddenly feel they can't be honest or critical or interrogative, which is just painful to the film industry. It doesn't do anyone any favors. The biggest mistake, I think, at least when I tell people that I work as a film critic, is that people imagine that as essentially like a recommendation engine, which I get that that's the function of some criticism. But I think especially now, as kind of longer form criticism and online criticism is becoming so dominant, I think less and less critics are functioning as like a kind of thumbs up or thumbs down kind of critic. And it's becoming much more, about analysis and about looking at a work and about responding to a work with your own work, even if it's written as opposed to film. So I think that's certainly a misconception in my mind. But then equally, if someone views their work as recommendation or as whatever the opposite recommendation is, then that's within their rights to do. And I know people who do take that approach. But I think people have a view of it as like, that's the kind of monolithic reality of what what film criticism is, which often makes explaining it at what I do at like family gatherings a bit more difficult. And you see it in comments as well. I'll write like 500 words on a film just about some thoughts I've had while watching the film. And, I wouldn't claim that that's all that brilliant or genius or whatever. But then you see in the comments, like, I can't even tell if this is positive or negative. And obviously there's so much more to film criticism than being positive or negative or telling someone to go and see it or to save their money. We've all reached for those things, but I think they're not the bedrock of what criticism is. Without meaning to be too kind of like highfalutin and artsy, like I honestly I don't think film criticism is anything other than like written work that pertains in some way to film. It's interesting that if you have a very high profile writer who writes around the subject of a film or whatever, people don't even necessarily call that criticism. Or if they write a fictional work that incorporates elements about film, people don't think of that as film criticism. And then often people don't really think of like the films I make about film as film criticism. But in my mind, all of that is wrapped up in film criticism, because I only see film criticism as like a mode of expression that relates to film. So I think that's an incredibly broad remit. I think most films are essentially film criticism. I think any kind of writing on film is film criticism. It's nothing and everything, and that's kind of why I like it. You know, I some of the most fascinating stuff I've read is the kind of thing that I'm sure half of my peers wouldn't even necessarily think of film criticism. I read this great book the other day that I now can't remember the name of, but it's basically just like someone's memoir, but they talk a lot about the films that kind of had an impact on their formative years. And they're barely talking about the way those films were made or what those films meant to anyone else or a larger culture, but they're talking about like their personal connections and what they took from a scene or whatever else. And that is incredibly invigorating to me. Like, I love that kind of writing. So I'm all for a willfully broad and perhaps unhelpfully broad definition that just kind of adds to a conversation around film. Certainly when I started, and this is a mistake that I think everyone makes, is that when I started writing film criticism, I had this abstract sense of what a film review was. Even though I didn't really read any at the time, I just sort of knew, like, okay, you sort of start by saying what it's about, and then you talk a bit about the acting and a bit about the cinematography, and you just go through it all. And so I would write these awful reviews of interest to no one, where I just sort of have like 10 adjectives and I attribute one to each different facet of the production. And I honestly can't imagine that was of interest to anyone. Can't imagine that you still see it all the time, and I can't imagine that people read these reviews and really care, because what does that tell you? That the acting is superb and cinematography is gorgeous or whatever else. Like, it's meaningless, you know, and these things have all become cliches anyway. And a major realization for me, about a few months probably into me attempting to do this and write this blog I used to run, was that I should just write the thing that was interesting to me and hope that anyone else would care. And so I think that was when I stopped seeing such a hard line between like what I would talk to my friends about when I came out of the film that interested me about it and what I would write about. So that's not to say I would express them the same way, you know, it doesn't have to be written conversationally, but I think the honesty of what actually interested me became my focus and is inevitably more interesting to anyone. You know, no one wants to read someone who's been kind of bullied into writing a piece. They want to read a piece that is come from within someone because it needs to. So I try now, you know, whoever I'm writing for, to start with what interests me and maybe fit that into the tone of the publication, but essentially not write a paragraph that isn't already kind of like filtering through my mind or conversations I have with other people. And that's always worked for me. And I think, you know, the vast majority of the film criticism I read as well is criticism that addresses an aspect of something rather than trying to take in the whole thing. And I'm amazed when I read these pieces where like maybe it's 5 paragraphs and 2.5 of them are the plot. Because that just seems like from another world. Like, you know, if I don't already know the plot of the film, which in the age of the internet and IMDb and Wikipedia or whatever is already a bit strange that I would ever get as far as reading a review without knowing anything about the film. But even if I don't, like, I want to learn the plot by kind of inference from actually reading the meat of what the person is interested in who's writing this thing. And I think there is still, which seems crazy in this day and age, this hangover expectation that a certain proportion of the review should be attributed to X, Y, and Z, which I can't believe will last for much longer. I feel like the critic as trusted authority thing, if it was ever as powerful as people say, is certainly not now. Like, I'm aware that there are certain people, and we're talking like 1 or 2 in the US, 1 maybe in the UK, Peter Bradshaw, who still have that kind of power. And I've talked to distributors who say that they will pre-screen a film for Peter Bradshaw, and if he reckons it would be a 4 or 5 star, they'll buy it and release it in the UK. Because for a certain kind of small scale art house release, that's all you need. And so that's fascinating and a mad amount of power for one person to wield. But obviously it's a tiny minority. And even the critics that I love and like trust. I wouldn't say I trust their taste, because I don't think I trust anyone's taste. I don't even know what that means. Taste is not like good or bad. But I trust their kind of confidence and their views and like their analytical skills and their art, basically. So like, I love the writing of like Wesley Morris, but if Wesley Morris really loves a film, that doesn't mean that I will. And if he really hates a film, that doesn't mean that I will. But I might be convinced to see it on the basis of like him arguing for this fascinating way to respond to it. And that can be with something he likes or dislikes. So I certainly, I would want my readers to kind of have a confidence in the words that I write. But very rarely are those words like, this is the best film of the year, you should go and see this film. It would be like, you won't believe how fascinating this aspect of this film is. And I hope, sure, that it provokes people to go and like find out for themselves or whatever, because I want there to be that level of engagement. But I really don't see myself as like the barrier between what gets released and what people watch. Well, this is the thing. Very rarely, like I am very lucky that probably the top 5 outlets I write for or have written for don't use them. Or even like, I write for The Guardian every week and they use them very rampantly, but it happens that the particular bit of The Guardian I write for doesn't use them. When I have had to use them, I know what you mean. Like, I suppose it's never been a big enough a part of my writing that I've had to worry about like, oh, if I give this 3 stars, are people just going to skip it because that's seen as like middling or uninteresting or whatever. And my approach has always basically been like, write the review, and then I just so don't care is the thing. Like, I'll write the review and then look at it and go, 3, I don't know, 4. And often I think because I so don't care, like I've had the experience, even the few times that I've had to do it, of very often having the editor change it and say, this reads more like 2 or 5 or whatever. Which, yeah, I think probably speaks to my lack of engagement with them. I do think, I do feel like that is dying out to some extent, that tendency for people to focus an inordinate amount on the star rating and skip. I think because at least online, I mean, the thing is, maybe this speaks more to a generational thing or the circle that I exist within socially or whatever. But I just find it so hard to believe that people in an age of, all the different ways that you can receive information about what's out or what's at the cinema, that people are like looking in the Saturday papers and going like, what's got the highest star rating, and picking it and then going and booking a ticket and then going to the cinema. Like that, I just can't quite believe that's how things work, at least for anyone other than the kind of Peter Bradshaw brigade in 2016. So I suppose when I talk about people having less and less interest in the star ratings, I'm probably thinking more about the people who would bother to read like film criticism of a film they've already seen, or film criticism like you were saying that doesn't have that reliance on star ratings. Yeah. But maybe I'm kind of in blissful ignorance. Maybe I'm dislocated from the reality of how people use reviews. I mean, surely it's been replaced by Rotten Tomatoes, right? The people who would just look at the star rating and use that as an indicator, why would they look at one review when they could look at the number of the Rotten Tomatoes and use that as a much, in theory, more accurate mathematical approximation of a film's quality? I think, yeah, if there's a kind of codified threat to people actually reading film criticism, it's probably Rotten Tomatoes now, and not the star ratings of individual reviews. No, it's interesting. And like, like the films I've made as well, I can never ascertain exactly how these, I think like my first film's got 70 odd on Rotten Tomatoes, maybe 6 something on IMDb, about the same on Letterboxd. It does seem to me like the amount you can take from it is fairly limited, given how much they just bunch in a specific area, i.e. the kind of 6 to 8 range. but maybe that's also because I really don't enjoy seeing good films more than bad ones. Like I cared a lot more, I think, when I was a teenager. That I was much more religious about sort of following what had a good IMDb score or Rotten Tomatoes score or whatever when I was younger. The kind of parallel distinction to be made, as well as critics who have star ratings or no star ratings, and I imagine you get a lot of crossover here, are critics who are commissioned and review everything, or review most things that come out, and critics who kind of pick what they review and pick what to write about. Because in a way, you could view the people who gravitate towards the high or low star ratings as basically trying to ascertain what the critic who writes about everything actually wants to write about. And it's not a good way of doing that, because obviously some of the most interesting films to write about fall in the 3 area. But I would say, Peter Bradshaw reviews 5 or 6 movies a week or whatever. Clearly his heart is not in reviewing all of them. He doesn't have strong feelings about all of those films. And I suppose if you pick the 5s and the 1s, you have a better chance of finding one that he feels really passionate about, as opposed to, like, I think all critics have had that experience of like, oh, I've just got to write something about, whatever the kind of middling indie film that's just been chucked out on 6 screens is that weekend that they really have no strong feelings about. So they'll do 200 words on it and give it a 3-star rating. So I can get why people would want to avoid that. And by contrast, why someone like Wesley Morris, who just reviews whatever they choose to review, there's always going to be passion in his writing, because he has the freedom and the privilege of writing about exactly what he wants to write about. Like, every distinction that felt like it had some merit in 2008 now to me feels laughable. Like, the most obvious one being any separation between online and print critics. Like, is there a single print critic who doesn't also write online, or whose work doesn't end up online in one way or another? And obviously, probably the majority of the most respected critics in the world write exclusively for online. So any distinction there has obviously gone out the window. I think likewise, distinctions between film criticism done in a visual medium or a text medium, for want of a better word, or even a kind of oral medium as well with podcasts. Like, I just think there's a much greater understanding and embrace of a much more fluid kind of film criticism now. And also of individual critics moving between those different worlds. So that can only be good. And yeah, it just generally feels like there's less. I think people feel less threatened by those distinctions than they used to, and so probably less reliant on them. A lot of the print critics who saw online as a threat now understand that they can just have an even bigger audience than they used to online, and are more happy to kind of embrace that. So it feels less kind of obsessed with those labels than it used to be. Yeah, I don't know so much about Facebook, but Twitter undoubtedly has been like a massive boon to me as a writer and as a filmmaker. Like, almost everything I've ever done or got to do has been either facilitated by, or kind of helped at least by the existence of Twitter and me having a audience on Twitter. So I think that's an amazing thing. I don't know that I don't sort of tweet like my immediate thoughts on films as often as I used to. I probably mainly use it as like a way to lead people elsewhere or share stuff. But again, I think it's interesting to kind of it sort of takes the kind of mighty, untouchable nature of film criticism and puts it in a more realistic setting, which I like. The same as Letterboxd. It's like getting away from this idea of like, that films have no context in people's lives. And, I like that the critic who tweets a link to their brilliant 2,000 word article on Son of Saul, you can still look back like a day in their tweets and see when they were, watching the trailer for some terrible looking Adam Sandler comedy, and like, you know, it brings more kind of honesty to it, which I think is nice. Yeah, well, I mean, there's nothing stopping you doing a pronouncement if you want to do a pronouncement. Like, if anything, it's sort of even easier in that, you know, in the days of print journalism, people could still write a letter to the editor, and that would probably be published, and then they could have a dialogue in that way. Like now, I could set up a website and give you absolutely no right of response, which is what I used to do on my blog. Like, before Twitter, there was absolutely no way of responding to that at all. And even after Twitter, you know, there was no way for people to necessarily have their views on my writing amplified if I didn't choose to share their thoughts in any way. So I think really it's just allowed the people the option of making it more conversational. And obviously a lot of people are choosing to, which is perfectly understandable. There's obviously like a difficulty in rendering that conversation interesting and reasonable. You know, I'm inordinately impressed by any website that manages to create a kind of interesting community atmosphere. So like the now defunct Pitchfork film site, The Dissolve, I think, you know, as good as the writing was, I think the most incredible thing about that site was the fact that you could go below the line and actually see discussions happening where people were bothering to express themselves in like a, you know, occasionally like flippant and silly way, but also like a very sincere, thought through way. And that's kind of like the dream of what online film discourse and online film culture could be, if you can get it, you know. And I don't know how they did it. I guess they probably removed a lot of people and cherry picked what they actually allowed to filter up. I've tried to engage with some of the stuff that shows up in the comments underneath my work, and it's just, I think the problem is, like, it's not only are the vast majority of commenters on there not interested really in a discussion or any kind of interesting nuance, but much more interested in kind of either making a kind of snappy comeback or just referencing some in-joke between the tiny little cabal of people who actually comment on that site. But also just the way that it's something even just as simple as like the interface of the site is really not conducive in the same way that the Dissolves was, for instance, at making a conversation happen and encouraging like a lively exchange of ideas. Like the Guardian's comment system is much more favorable to just sort of like single comments from people that have a statement in response. And sometimes they're fine and sometimes they're great, but it doesn't make you want to kind of engage, or because if I reply, my reply just ends up somewhere else on a different page. And, you know, until recently you couldn't even organize them by the number of votes that they had. So all you would see is like the most recent ones, which would just be meaningless, like howlings into the void. So yeah, they definitely could be doing a lot better in terms of that. And if they were, I would love to. Like I always do on Twitter. I'm very happy to discuss stuff with people on Twitter. In terms of its literal existence, I don't feel like people are going to stop printing stuff particularly soon. At least the kind of big stuff. But it certainly is dead in terms of my perception of film criticism or really any journalism. You know, I don't buy any print outlets really, except actually, you know, and this is an interesting argument for this model, I do still buy like Sight and Sound and a couple of other outlets that refuse to put any of their content online. But stuff where I have the option of reading it online, I will every time. And so I've certainly got to a point where I don't even know if what I'm reading exists in print somewhere else or will ever be put into print, which is inevitable, you know.
So you won't miss it, is what you're saying. You won't notice.
I really don't care about the sort of, I have no nostalgic appreciation of the physical sensation of it, certainly.
And what future do you see for film criticism and more particularly for the professional film critic? And by professional, I mean paid.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I suppose that is probably the biggest impact that the disappearance of print will have, I suppose. And I should say, I think I'm fairly naive about the actual financial impact that has had on the industry of film criticism. I certainly haven't felt it as I've moved from writing for more print outlets to more online ones. But then I was never, like an established voice in a print world. And certainly I was never like on anyone's payroll. And now facing a reality where all I can do is freelance for various different online outlets. So I'm no doubt that there are lots of people who are hit much harder than this than I ever would have been. I don't see why it can't work. I mean, it's going to have to. There's absolutely no alternative. And I think if all the film criticism in the world suddenly dried up, people would have an issue with that and would have a yearning for it. So I think however long it takes, people will find a way. And like, besides, all the scaremongering that used to happen 10 years ago about what will happen if we move away from print, and all the quality will fall out of criticism, none of it has proven to be true. If anything, all the kind of low quality early online film criticism outlets have sort of fallen away and given rise to these incredibly thoughtful, beautifully nuanced outlets, which to me are often way more appealing than what was in print 10 years ago when people were scaremongering that this would never happen. So, it doesn't seem to have panned out. I think unless it's a writer that I recognize the name of, or that I have a familiarity with the work of, I think I'm less and less aware whether what I'm reading is written by, someone who makes a sole living doing this job, or has just decided to write this piece for whatever reason. Especially now that kind of self-publishing platforms look so slick and almost unrecognizable from a lot of the major outlets. So I certainly don't feel like it affects the response I have to it or how much faith I put in the words. Except that I would say, in the vast majority of cases, the writers that I wind up really enjoying and the writing that I wind up really enjoying happens to be people who are doing it professionally. And I don't know if that will be less and less true as we get away from this kind of thing where it's like an industry and it's centralized and all this sort of stuff. But for now, at least, it does feel like to some extent, people who are good at it can find a way to get paid doing it. Maybe that will be less and less true. But I certainly know a lot of people who are bad at it, who are getting paid to do it. So even if they just slowly get replaced by the people who are good at it and aren't getting paid, then it feels sustainable, at least for a little while. Like, I suppose one more thing to add, maybe with the thing we were talking about, where I was saying I think it's got more fluid and criticism has become less defined by these different distinctions. I think that's true not just of the way the criticism is being written, but of the films that are being written about. That I think it's going to get to a place where it's less and less important what is out when, whether you're writing about a film that came out 3 months ago, 3 years ago, or is out next week. People seem to see less and less of a clear line between home entertainment and theatrical releases, which obviously will become less and less of a distinction as that window gets smaller. So I think that's interesting as well, because I think the readers and the viewers have been way quicker to that realization than a lot of the commissioners and the writers. And I certainly, because I write about home ent notionally, but there was a point where I remember having this conversation with The Guardian where I kind of made the case that I should write less religiously tied to the release schedule and kind of recognize the fact that when most people sit down to watch a film at home, they don't necessarily go like, okay, so what was out on Monday? Can you go to HMV on the way home and buy this DVD? They just look at what's available to them, or look back at 100 years of cinema history and go like, oh, what do you want to watch from the millions of films available to us right now at the click of a button? And once The Guardian said that was cool for me to do, and I started writing about, maybe one week it'd be a new release DVD, maybe the next week it'd be a film from 25 years ago that's just popped up on Netflix. And the response was perfect proof of this. The audience really didn't care. Often we would get a lot more views and shares and all those kind of metrics on content that was seemingly not new, but that maybe was written about in a new way, or that was on people's minds for whatever reason. So I think, those kind of distinctions as well will become less and less relevant. You now have a whole strand of kind of online criticism that's built up around what's new on Netflix this week. And so a film will pop up on Netflix, and then an outlet will write a feature about that film that's maybe 15 years old, and you could have walked out last week and bought a copy of from any shop, or you could have downloaded off iTunes very, very easily. But there seems to be this recognition that loads of people are going to end up watching this film this week because it's just been added to Netflix. And so I think that's an interesting shift, and I could see that becoming much more pervasive across all media.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And as fewer of us go to the cinema, right? As well.
Yeah, potentially, or just that cinemas again maybe become less defined by opening weekends and opening nights and all this kind of stuff. Like I work as a film critic, and I couldn't tell you what's out this Friday. But obviously, I'm talking slight. Well, that's the other thing, I suppose, is while the notion of opening weekends and cinemas and blah 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 get blurrier, still the very top 1% of 1% are gonna make sure that protocol remains. So actually, the tentpole movies are actually just getting stronger and stronger in their opening weekends, and they're not being dented at all. I read the other day that the average US teenager goes to the cinema 6 times a year, which is inconceivable to even to me, who grew up with DVD and everything and had lots of other options. But still, I went to the cinema definitely every week, and I went a lot, but even my friends who weren't interested would have gone once a month very easily. Yep. The idea that now they go every 2 months to see the big, the $200 million movies, is definitely a clear sign of where things are going. And they're only going because the $200 million movies are the ones you can't pirate.
Yep. God, that's depressing. But yeah.
Did you see this thing the other day about the Napster, the Sean Parker, Sean Parker's new project? Sean Parker's come up with this thing that is something obviously a lot of different people have tried, but this one has the backing of several of the major studios, Spielberg, all these people.
I didn't see it. Oh wait, you can pay immediately on opening weekends.
You pay £150 for $150 for the box, and then you pay $50 for the movie on opening weekend to watch it at home within a 48-hour window or whatever.
I bet that cinemas are crapping themselves. Yeah. They'll think that's...
Well, a lot are pushing back. Yeah. And the interesting thing is that of that $50, $20 goes to cinemas as hush money almost, because they have no role in it. They don't offer anything, but they're being paid off as basically this is the money you would have made if they'd come and seen it at the cinema.
But that very quickly will become a false economy. That will
of course. What are they going to do? Just be these big empty buildings that are getting loads of money from Sean Parker? I think the cannier ones are probably turning that offer down, but it is inevitable. I mean, interestingly, did you see that there's also, because I didn't know about this, but apparently for years this product has already existed. That if you are willing to pay, I think $25,000 for the box, and then $750 to $1,000 for each film, you can just have a 2K cinema projector installed in your home, and they'll bring new release movies to your home on an encrypted DCP, and you can watch them. So this already exists, and the reason the cinemas have been fine with this is because the price point is so ludicrous that it's just millionaires. Basically, millionaires and billionaires already have this service, and cinemas are fine to let them do what they want, but the rest of us have to wait.
Whereas £50 for a film,
Mm-hmm.
That's a lot more than a single ticket. But if you're in a household of 4,
Yeah.
it's a lot less.
It's like, I would never pay that, but from what I understand,
Yeah.
2 parents and kids and all the popcorn and blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
And people just, also there's a huge audience will pay not to go to the cinema. A huge audience actually, like we all like are reverent to the idea of the movie palace and you sit in the dark and oh, isn't it wonderful, and the communal experience. Some people hate going to the cinema and would pay more to not, which I think is a factor that is often forgotten when people are like, because also, you and I, like we're privileged. We go to like fancy, nice cinemas, often for free, and have a wonderful experience in these pristine cinemas that are there just for us. The average person doesn't get to go to nice cinemas. Like they go to whatever's local to them. Often they're awful. The multiplex chains barely bother to upkeep the ones that they don't really care about. They just look after their Leicester Square ones. I remember even like growing up in South London, which is obviously still in London, like they're putting a fair amount of effort into these cinemas. But going to like the Streatham Odeon or the Putney Odeon or any of these cinemas, like they look like no one's been there in 10 years to check whether the projector is still pointing direct or to check whether the sound is coming out of all the speakers.
And also, if you go to a press screening, there's a different etiquette. There's a much stricter etiquette.
Yeah, no one talks,
in the audience.
and you have a very pure experience. Whereas, cinemas obviously are not a controllable space really for seeing a film in.
So, personally, I think cinemas are doomed. But
and don't get me wrong, I'll be really disappointed. Like I like going to the cinema. Well, I can't quite believe that there won't be a cinema in London in 50 years. There might be a tenth as many.
Yeah.
But there's going to be a cinema, I'm sure, of some kind for people who want to go.
Tweet a photo.
Yeah.
So what is it like? Because
you already experienced it. Wow.
Yeah, like I don't think I'm a bit more. I love it. I'm a total convert.
Oh yes.
I'm a bit more cynical. I don't think it will replace
normal. It will play alongside
fixed frame cinema. I don't think it will do that, but I do think it's the most promising, remarkable new device for narrative storytelling I've ever seen. I think it's phenomenal what it will do. Like I watched a 10-minute documentary that was the most boring thing I've ever seen, and it still blew my mind the possibilities of it, because it's just storytelling in a completely new sense. It's like it's redefined as not a kind of authorial pointing of the audience in a direction or telling them what to appreciate, but as like spaces. It's like temporal and spatial, and yet you're totally still in control of those things. Like the filmmaker can put you in a room, leave you there for 10 seconds and tell you a piece of information, and then plunge you into darkness, and then you're in another room. Like it's still, you're at the mercy of it still. It's not like this idea that people have that it's like a video game and like you just, any sense of storytelling is removed and lets people just control it. It can be just as controlling, but in a much more interesting way, or equally but differently interesting.
It's great. That's amazing.
It's exciting, but like at least the couple of things I saw in it were terrible. I think it's going to take a while before anyone's doing anything particularly interesting with it. But when I was 15, I saw a year's worth of cinema for about £95, and it was just like the best thing that ever happened to me. Whereas you're right, like what's £95 in IMAX tickets? Like 4 trips, maybe? Bit more,
25 or £30? I'm not entirely sure.
They certainly go to 20. Like I'm going to see, do you know what I'm seeing tomorrow for the first time? Is the new Star Wars film.